wider audience than the ones who bother coming in. But I'm going to call this discussions on Sasanian history. And what I mean by that is that I'm not going to go run through a linear narrative of Sasanian political history, something that you can probably get in any sort of article, book, stuff that I have written, stuff that others have written. You can even get it probably on Wikipedia. That's important to discuss, and I will point those out. But that's not really my purpose here. I'm not here to tell you the story of the Sasanian Empire, but rather want to talk about a bit about how to be a historian and how historians work, because I think there is a lack of understanding of how historical inquiry goes. We still have this understanding among the wider public that history is a collection of facts. Whenever you tell somebody that you're a historian, the first response is, oh, you should have a really good memory. And then on the other hand, on not understanding the difference between a historical researcher and somebody who just likes history or reads history. So the second response is what are you doing that is different than the history that is already being written? So I'm going to go a bit through the historical methodology, a craft of a historian. And I'm not going to quintessentially lecture on how you do history or how to be a historian in that sense, but I'm hoping that through showing you the way a historian works, I can be somehow useful and bring about the process of historical inquiry in the modern sense, in an academic sense, out. So, with that being said, let me make a little introduction. My name is Khodadad Reza Khani. I am, as you might know, historian of late antiquity. Most of my work has taken place on the history of Central Asia and West Asia, the area of Iran and Central Asian republics and Afghanistan, and then on this side, Iraq and the greater Syria and Eastern Mediterranean. I have a wide set of interests because I'm not really, in a sense, a specialist of the regions the way it has been classical to be. I'm a historian. I'm not a area studies person or an Oriental studies person. I was educated as a historian and was taught to be, treats the history of everywhere like often the way, sadly, only the history of Europe is studied within a larger context. Plus the fact that I also have a deep interest in global history as a discipline and the understanding of big picture history, if you want to call it, or longue durée history. And its various versions, which I think one of the most prominent ones is the connected histories concept. So I look at this, my own period, my period of late antiquity and generally Central and West Asia in this greater context. The reason I'm talking mostly about the Sasanians is because that's a lot of my research, but it's not necessarily all of it. And areas that I study are also happen to be outside the Sasanian Empire. So most of the Central Asian regions that I have written about in my first book and in many of my papers are not actually part of the Sasanian Empire politically when you talk about it. You can't even really call it part of the Persianate world or something like the Iranian world in many of the senses of the word. It's too early for the Persianate world, and Iranian might be a little either anachronistic or a little unusual, because then, in the general conceptualization of the Iranian world, we don't, for example, include Iraq or parts of the Arabian Peninsula. So that cannot be a good title for it either. So maybe looking at it in an imperial sense would be sort of a useful way of framing it. So I am generally calling it the Sasanian Empire, but you could also just as well call it late antique Central and West Asia. Now, As I said, I'm not going to go through the details of Sasanian history. I'm not going to give you a narrative of Sasanian political history and everything else, but rather talk about the methodology and how we study it. But I am going to be chronological about this. I'm going to start from a certain period, which is the beginning, obviously the foundation of the empire. I think my main way of approaching this would be to give you a short version of the political history of the period that I want to talk about, and then proceed to talking about its details, its methodology, its sources, and what is the question there. What are we asking? Why are we asking a particular thing? Also, I'm going to, before I start that, I'm going to make another technical thing. I'm going to turn off the comments. If you have any questions, there is a question mark button usually next to the comments that you can hit. And there you can actually ask questions. And if you post the questions, I will see them. Towards the end, around 10 minutes to the end, because these are 1 hour limits, I will turn on the comments. And if anybody wants to have a live comment as well, I will try to answer those. But if you want to ask a question, hit that question mark in the rectangle and ask your question, and I will try to look at them occasionally. So I will turn off the comments right now to make it easier. So the Sasanian Empire. Well, basic frame of it is it's an empire that rules over most of what is Central Asia and a great part of West Asia. Most of what is West Asia and great part of Central Asia. I said it backwards. Between around 224 to roughly, say, 640 AD. We talk about the end date. I'm giving very rough dates in this sense. And their area of control is the modern country of Iran and modern country of Iraq. Those are the regions that they are most securely ruling. Parts of what is now Afghanistan, parts of what is now Turkmenistan, and then various other regions, including Eastern Arabia at various points, and sometimes even South Arabia, Yemen, and at one point, obviously, during the time of Khosrow Parviz, the conquest of the entire, what is known as the Near East, so Greater Syria and Egypt even. But we don't count those really for most of that as part of their territory. So if you want to look at it geographically, and I do have some maps that I can put links to later, on Iran and Iraq would be the safest places, and Iran and Iraq are the bulk of the territory of the Sasanians. Obviously, a lot of you know that in around 224, Ardeshir Babakan, Ardeshir son of Babak, the founder of the dynasty, rises out of the province of Fars, which is in southern Iran today, in the region very close to the Achaemenid capital of, or main city, or whatever you want to call it, of Persepolis, that is quite well known, from a city called Istach, whose ruins are probably around 1.5 kilometers from the palace of Persepolis, and defeats the Parthian or Arsacid Empire, or Ashkani in Persian, which comes from the name of Arsaces, its founder. And eventually proceeds to conquer most of the territory that I described. So most of Iran and Iraq, and eventually the Caucasus, great parts of the Caucasus as well. As I said, you can look at the map that I have put on my Iranology website as a general reference for it. Now, what is associated with this foundation before I go anywhere is that those are the facts that we have. That Ardeshir son of Babak rises to power out of the province of Fars, out of the region of Istach, and attacks and defeats Artabanus IV, or based on something that I wrote, I would argue Artabanus V, but that's another story, and basically establishes the first stage of Sasanian rise to power. How the conquests happen, which direction they take, is a matter of controversy by itself. Ardeshir then proceeds to conquer and defeat and conquer the territory of Vologases Six, the brother of Artaban, and eventually generally ends up suppressing other regional rulers based on the traditional narrative that we have of the regions in the east and on the northeast, and establishes himself as an emperor. Now, I will talk about that aspect of it later, that this often in the early modern period by historians has been called the Second Persian Empire. So understanding is as the first Persian Empire is the empire of the Achaemenids, Cyrus and Darius and others, and the second empire is the Sasanians, and what comes in between is the Parthian Empire of the Arsacids. So there is a separation assigned to this, and that's often linguistic because it's understood that the Achaemenids are speaking Old Persian, and Sasanians are most associated with Middle Persian, and that Arsacids speak Parthian, which is another Middle Iranian language. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by Sorry, I shouldn't pay attention to that. The Parthian language is understood as standing outside this continuum of Middle Persian. So the first and the second Persian empires is what it is getting the name of. I don't necessarily believe in such division. I don't think that it was as clear, because then this is extended into study of the structure of the Sasanian Empire. Sasanian Empire is presented by modern historians and even by medieval historians as the anti-Arsacids, that they came and changed the Arsacid setting, so that Arsacids are this decentralized, almost nomadic empire, which in the medieval texts are called Muluk o Tawayif in Arabic, the kings of various tribes. One of our colleagues, Robert Hoyland, in his translation of the Arabic texts on this period of Iranian history, calls them the party king, coming from being parties, different parties, and I think making a joke about the Parthians as well, but basically tribal kingdoms. And that Sasanians are coming and centralizing this empire strongly, which is something that has been dismissed by many people and is generally not an accepted view, at least for the past, I would say, 20, 30 years, that centralization, having been established by Ardashir himself, is sort of very childish to think. That he comes and completely changes everything. It has a quality of a history of salvation writing, that the Ardashir is coming in order to take the entire Iranian nation towards a destiny, which is the centralized nation with a centralized identity, which was often imagined to be. So it's reflecting more of a much later memory of them. Structurally, that's not the case, and I will talk about this later. But this time around, I'm actually going to concentrate a bit on that background of Ardashir and where he comes from, because that's often not very known, strangely enough. We have that little knowledge of he comes from Persis, he comes from Fars, he comes from the city of Estakhr, and that he just rises and destroys the Arsacids. And no context is really given about what's happening in Fars, what is there before. Obviously, going through the actual history of the kingdom of Persis, it requires its own series of podcasts and videocasts. But I think just mentioning what's happening there is a useful thing to give a context to the Sasanian rise. Now, if you notice, the center of the Arsacids' activities, generally towards the end of their rule, is in Mesopotamia. And then we have a second power, which is what is in Media, which is the area of Hamadan and southern Azerbaijan, and generally what we imagine was the territory of the Median people, and later gets to be called Mah, and even later gets to be called Jabal in the Arabic historical and geographical treaties. And in this sense, our Sassanids have created a Western empire in the territories that they are ruling. And there is an issue about what is happening in the south and the east of this empire. It's too lengthy for me to go through all of them, but I can tell you that they are sub-Arsacid kingdoms in all of these regions. So starting from the very west and south in the area that is now the city of Basra and southern Iraq, there is the kingdom of Kharasin. And then you come further east and you come to the area of what is today the province of Khuzestan in Iran, and you get the kingdom of Elimayas. And then you go further east, you get the kingdom of Persis, which I will come back to and is going to be the focus of my discussion. And even further east is what you can only call the kingdom of Sakistan, the kingdom of the eastern Iranian kingdom of Sistan, which at this period or a bit before it is being ruled by a dynasty that the modern historians call Indo-Parthians. There are various studies of Indo-Parthians that I have tried to aggregate and sort of present a general view of in the first chapter of my book, Reorienting the Sasanians. We know them mostly through their coins. I will talk about the problem of sources later. We know them mostly through their coins because there are no narrative sources for them. And they seem to be an empire. They seem to be a large kingdom at least. And so none of these are really very well studied. Kharasin is a bit studied. Elimayas is less studied. Persis is just coming to vogue to be studied. And Indo-Parthians are pretty much only studied in the context of their coins and a bit of archaeology. And not really as far as their political role goes. The only thing that I can suggest about Indo-Parthians is an article that Marek Jan Ulbricht wrote about 4 or 5 years ago on the possibility of the Indo-Parthians not just being an eastern kingdom, but rather an eastern half of the Parthian Arsacid Empire itself. And that is a theory that I would like to go through when we get to that stage of when the Sasanians get to the east, and I will talk about it later. But I just want to give you this overview and then go back to the kingdom of Persis. So what is kingdom of Persis? Generally it is called a Hellenistic kingdom, meaning that this is a kingdom that is forming after Alexander, that it is borrowing some characteristics that are imported from the Hellenistic cultures that are well known after Alexander and are best exemplified by Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt or the Seleucid kingdom of Syria and Mesopotamia, and that these powers are often ruled by some sort of a Greek worldview. Anything from being influenced by the Greek ideas of statecraft to actual prominence of the Greek language, to the prominence of, for example, things such as the police, city building, urban culture being imposed, and with visual effects of the importation of what we understand as Greek art, and everyday uses of it, like their creation of the coins. So these are the things that generally gets to be the overall characteristics of a Hellenistic civilization. And Persis gets grouped under this as well. Again, if we want to go actually through what Hellenism is and what Hellenistic culture precisely means, that requires an entire book, and books have been written about it. I can also suggest a couple of those. But in the Persis' case, there is a curious thing. A lot of those characteristics are really missing. And we have no reason that cities of Persis were a police system of urban setup. There doesn't seem to be any control of the cities by city councils and by what we might call the the governing body of the city. These seem to be royal cities. Cities like Istakhr or Darab Gerd or later Firuzabad they do not seem to be Greek-style polis system cities. They are just royal cities. Second one is we don't really see any Greek used in the kingdom of Persis. On their coins, they are not using Greek. They are writing in Aramaic. They are writing in a script that is basically taken from Imperial Aramaic, which was the most common script of the Achaemenid Empire. So it seems to be a continuity from the late Achaemenid period. Their coins initially are borrowed from Hellenistic coins of the Seleucids. So the earliest coins seem to actually be overstrikes of Seleucid kings. And they do adopt particularly Hellenistic characteristics, such as the king always having a diadem on his head. The weight standard is quite a bizarre thing. It's based on the dirham weight standard, but it's not necessarily that. So it's a mix. It's a bit of an unusual situation. It is a Hellenistic kingdom as far as the study of them in the modern sense goes, but when you go back to them, they show less and less of it. Early kingdom of Persis rulers seem to be independent. They call themselves Frataraka, which is actually an Achaemenid administrative title. It's a military and administrative title. They appear to be somehow local, although there is no mention, but there are mentions of them giving the name of the land of Persis as the territory of their rule. They seem to be based in Istakhr, although there are ideas that there is not one dynasty of Persis, there might be more than one. I give you a standard narrative first and then go back and try to insert some problems into it. The first series has about 6 rulers. It ends with a king called Darius, or on his coin he actually says Darev or Darayan, depending on how you read the name, which seems to be the earlier version of the Persian name Dara, which is the natural evolution of the name Darius, Daria Vahosha, into Persian. So Darev, Darayan seems to be the earlier version of Dara. And after him, the coin series have a shift. Thereafter, another Darayan starts calling himself king, or he actually writes it on his coin in Aramaeogram, as he uses the official Aramaic version of the title, which is MLK and the Hamza, which cognates obviously with Malch and Malik and various other Semitic words, but is most likely pronounced as Shah. That is one of the problems. We don't know if these coins are really reflecting an earlier version of Middle Persian writing, or if they are purely Aramaic. Are they actually reading this as Malik, or are they reading it as Shah? This is a matter. I will create a little parenthesis here. Aramaeograms are the ways you write a word in Middle Persian, in Pahlavi writing of Middle Persian, which is the common way of writing during the Sasanian period, in which you write the word in Aramaic but pronounce it in Persian. So you would write MLK and then read it as Shah. You would a lot of the verbs are written like this. So the verbs are written in a frozen form in Aramaic but pronounced in Middle Persian. This is not that strange actually. If you think of it in English, we write LBS and then we read it as pounds. So you write something and that those letters don't really matter. You don't read the LBS. You write, if you're going to buy something is £5, they write it 5 LBS. So think of it like that, but in English is only 1 or 2 examples. Imagine a writing system where all of the fixed words are written like this. So the word rose, for example, in Middle Persian, which means day, is written YWM, the Aramaic version of the name, the word for rose. But it's pronounced rose. And we know that this was pronounced as such because we have dictionaries to teach the scribes how to write these words. So if you want to write rose, this is how you have to write it. Write it YWM. And so on and so forth. So going back to Persis, we don't really know. Are they doing this? Are they actually reading it as Shah? Or are they actually still using Aramaic? Because Aramaic as a language was used in the Achaemenid period. So we don't know this Persis period. Have they switched into doing it like Middle Persian? Are they doing an earlier version of Middle Persian and reading these in Middle Persian? Or are they just treating this as an administrative language and both the script and the language are together still at this point? So anyway, going through this, the Persis series goes through the kings of Persis. There seems to be at least 2 dynastic changes. And then at the very end of it, you all of a sudden have first of all, a stylistic change. And then what happens is there is a king or a local ruler who calls himself Pabag. And then his sons, Shapur, son of Pabag, and then obviously Ardashir, son of Pabag. This is our friend Ardashir, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty. So initially, he appears on his coins as a son of Pabag, a previous ruler, and the local ruler of Persis. So Ardashir is the last king of Persis, really. And he belongs to a mini dynasty of the Ardashir, his older brother Shapur, who also has coins, and then their father Pabag, who doesn't really have coins of his own, rather is reflected in the coins of his sons, but he's mentioned as a king. So the general understanding of this has been that Pabag is a rebel king, rising against the legitimate kings of Persis, whose coins we have also, establishing this little dynasty of himself, then his son Shapur, and then his other son Ardashir. And then Ardashir, from this rebellion, proceeds to conquering more and more and bringing down the Arsacid dynasty and establishing the Sasanian Empire. So this is the context that I wanted you to know about, that Ardashir is not coming out of the blue. He is already a local ruler, and he's a local ruler of a dynasty that at that point has probably around 350 years of history. So for around 350 years, the rulers of Persis have been pretty much either on an independent basis or as autonomous rulers ruling over the Persis region. It has a local context. Now, I'm going to, again, not go back through the entire kingdom of Persis, but tell you several things about this. One thing is that, first of all, we have the narrative of all of the Persis kings based on their coins. So numismatics, the study of coins here, is very important. That's really the main foundation of our knowledge of the Persis dynasties, or as I said, dynasties. I'm making the plural because I mean to say something. But everything else we really are extracting from bits and pieces of references in minor sources. Some Roman sources make a mention of a couple of Persis kings. Some, in the context of the contacts with the Arsacids, there is a couple of mentions as well. In the context of Seleucid history, there is a little bit of a context as well. But we really don't have much narrative history of these people. On the other hand, we also don't have much archaeology. Sadly, archaeology has been really poor in studying this region. Apart from the nature of archaeology in Iran, which has often been monumental, concentrating on big buildings, and actually from this dynasty we have a post-Achaemenid temple just off the main platform of Persepolis. If you ever go to Persepolis, you can see it, and it's called the Temple of the Frataraka. So it is related to this dynasty. It is showing Achaemenid architectural norms, but it seems to be post-Achaemenid and probably built by the Fratarakas or the kings of Persis. But again, as you can see, it's a big building. We don't have much land surveys, digging and trying to figure out. We don't actually have a good excavation of the city of Istakhr itself. So the Istakhr, which seems to be the capital of Persis and stay the capital of Persis throughout the entire Sasanian period, and stay the most important city of Persis during the first 100 years of the Islamic rule as well, before Shiraz replaces it. This entire history of 400, something around 900 to 1,000 years, really we don't know much about it because there hasn't been very good archaeological work done on it. And in other places as well, in Firuzabad, in Darabgird, in Nisan, none of these places have really been excavated very well. So that's the second part of our problem. So understanding the history of the Persis kingdom is kind of a struggle. I have myself written a couple of articles about their numismatics because that's all we have really from them. But even figuring out who is who and who's coming first and who's after is a bit hard. So I give you one little thing because that becomes important about contextualizing the tiny dynasty of Babak and his two sons. We imagine that there is a linear continuity among the coins of the Persis kings. So the Frataraka stop calling themselves Frataraka, then start calling themselves kings, and then we have another shift which enters a bit of an Arsacid coinage style into the Persis series, so a little bit of a style of the Arsacids. Then that develops into its own style, where you have the head of a king in the obverse and a head of another king in the reverse, and we have the names of them. So we have the mention of that the person on the obverse is the son of the person on the reverse. And then you have some more iconographic change, which I'm going to leave for a little later and tell you about. And these are all following each other. Now there is no reason to imagine this. There is absolutely no reason to imagine that sometimes two of these kings could coexist, or that two of these coinage styles could coexist, coinage series could coexist simultaneously. It's quite possible that there were two dynasties, that somebody ruled in Istakhr and somebody ruled in another region of Persis. We don't actually know this. There is no way to establish that. And the reason I'm mentioning this is rise of Ardashir himself in much, much later sources, so early Islamic sources, so we're talking about 700 years later, is described as such. Ardashir is a son of a local ruler called Babak, a local grandee called Babak. The king of Persis is a person that is called Guzehr or Jozehr in Arabic, who seems to be ruling in Istakhr. Ardashir's father, who is one of the local grandees and might be married to the daughter of this Gozer, asks the king to appoint Ardashir as the next in line to inherit the rule of the castle of Darabgird, which is on the eastern side of Persis, close to the border of Kerman. And this becomes the basis of Ardashir's power. So after the castellan of Darabgird is dead, Ardashir takes over, then uses Darabgird as his base, and then conquers Istakhr. Now, this narrative is probably nonsense because it ignores several things. First of all, it completely discounts the role of Babak, Ardashir's father. Imagines him as a nobleman, but not anybody who is important. And gives the entire credit for the rebellion and establishment of the dynasty and the mini-dynasty to Ardashir himself, which again causes the second problem, because we know that Shapur, the older brother of Ardashir, was a king. Because then also Islamic sources also tell us that Ardashir and Shapur go to meet somewhere in the middle of a civil war thing, and they actually are supposed to meet in Persepolis, in the palace of Persepolis, which probably by that time, with many changes, exists, at least a couple of the palaces. And then what happens is that by accident, as I put the quotation marks over there, you probably know that that's not serious, the ceiling of the palace collapses on Shapur's head and kills him. which is probably a nice way of saying that Ardashir manages to kill him, or has somebody collapse the ceiling on him. But the narrative that says that Ardashir is the heir of the Darabgird castle, and that's how it starts, completely ignores this. Ignores that his father was a ruler and his older brother was a ruler. So this is nonsense. The other reason we know that this narrative is nonsense is that we have no reason to think that Darabgird existed before the Sasanians. The Darabgird seems to be a Sasanian foundation. So it being a major castle is a fact of the early Islamic period. But something that we can probably take out of this is that there are two centers of power, or at least more than one center of power. We know that physically the center of Ardashir's power, even when he becomes the ruler of the entire empire, is about 2 hours south of Shiraz in the city of Firuzabad, or Gur, that is now exists even, and we have the palaces of Ardashir and several other Sasanian foundations there. So maybe that was the second center of power. All that we can know is that there seems to be more than one center of power. And so it is quite possible that Ardashir's dynasty, Ardashir's mini dynasty, let's call the Pabags dynasty, in Fars, is in fact representative of a second center of power against the Estakh power. And so if we actually believe in this, then we have the possibility that these coin series actually belong to the two different centers of power. That they don't need to be linear and continuous. That some of the coins are actually the coins of Estakh, and some of the coins are the coins of either Firuzabad or Darabgird or whatever is in the east. So this is something that seems to be established, which if we actually really go back to the history of Persis, then we might read the entire history of the kingdom of Persis differently. So having told you all of this, I hope I have drawn a rather convincing picture of what we don't know, which is a lot, and what we can speculate. We know that Ardashir is from Persis. We know that he is not the first person of the dynasty to rise in rebellion. We know that his initial success is control of Persis. We know that he's replacing the local dynasty, or his father has already, and he's establishing it. There are coins of him before, and that his center of power eventually becomes the area of Firuzabad, Gur, Khor Ardashir in south of Fars, which by itself is interesting. I think one episode I might actually talk about the geography of the Sasanians, because again, we think of the Sasanians as a central plateau kingdom or the west, but it's very interesting to see what the Sasanians are doing along the southern shore, the Persian Gulf region, and how their power from there actually ends up not only controlling that region, but being very much informed by the political realities of the coastal region. But that's an argument for later. So this is so far what I wanted you to know. The kingdom of Persis, the context of the rise of Ardashir. One more thing that I want to point out is, or actually two more things, but they are related, is that Eastern origin. So the Darabgird issue I told you, there is no reason to argue that Darabgird existed before the Sasanians. I don't think there is any good archaeology. I like to see if there is really good archaeology. But it doesn't mean that nothing was there. There is a possibility that there were urban foundations. And that is the reason I'm saying this, is because of a curious thing. The coins of the Persis series before Ardashir, among the many stylistic changes on them, is the appearance of a fire altar, something that you can only call a fire altar. I wish I could bring a picture of this here, but I will leave it on the website for you to see. A fire altar appears on the back of the coins, probably with an attendant. Now, if you look at Sasanian coins, the canonical, almost never missing image on the reverse of Sasanian coins is a large fire altar with two attendants on both sides, with the fire in the middle, or sometimes the bust of a god, And then, the date and things get written around it. But this fire altar with 2 attendants is present constantly. And there's an argument where it comes from. Well, we have one evidence of it on the coinage of Persis. It's a smaller fire altar with 1 attendant sometimes without an attendant, just the altar. And this leads us to 2 very important matters. One is that Ardashir's rise is associated with some sort of a religious position. Traditional stories goes that Ardashir's grandfather, Sasan, the eponymous founder of the dynasty, of whom we have almost no evidence, by the way, and as you saw I didn't talk about, was a priest, and that his father Babak was also a priest of so-called the Temple of Anahid in Istakhr, which again we have no evidence of, and we know based on only early Islamic sources. But the family of Ardashir in the later sources, in Islamic sources, given some sort of a religious authority. I personally don't think there is anything to it. I don't accept the idea that family of Ardashir had any religious context. But it might come from the fact that they do somehow follow a royal cult, a royal particularly central cult, which might be associated with this fire altar. And this might really, the fire altar might really show that you have an established, at least a family cult for the Sasanians. This is one, that what the fire altar does. The other one that relates it to the east is that although the fire altar exists on the back of the Persis coins, what doesn't exist is the fire altar that you can very easily connect to the Sasanian fire altar. The shape, the iconography is very different. But there is a contemporary, very close iconographically very similar coin to the ones that appears later on the Sasanian coins. And that is the coins of the kings of Sistan, that Indo-Parthian dynasty or their later remnant. Specifically, there is a king who seems to be a contemporary of Ardashir. His name is Farn Sasan. Notice his name has the name Sasan in it. So the dynastic name of Ardashir is part of that person's name, Farn Sasan. On the back of his coins, on the reverse of his coins, there is an altar which is almost exactly like the altar on the back of the Sasanian coins, which creates interesting links for you, which creates a lot of arguments, which I'm not going to get into. One thing that makes maybe similar is that does this represent the same cult, first of all? And then the fact that this is an Eastern dynasty, this is a dynasty that rules over Sistan and probably part of Kerman. Is it possible that Ardashir actually is coming from the east? Maybe he is coming from even further east than we think, than Darabgerd. Maybe he's coming from the region of Kerman. And from there it is the family of Pabag and Ardashir start a second power and then eventually take the main power in Istakhr and go on to conquer the entire Arsacid Empire and establish the Sasanians as an empire. So it's very little to go on. This is what ancient historians have to deal with. And I will talk about, again, lack of sources, more detail later. But you see what we are working on. We are working on coins and how we can extract information from so little evidence, and how you need, as a historian, to have the skills and the tools to extract this information. And it's speculative, it's not certain. When we get to the certainties that we have archaeology and text for, that becomes a different story. But things such as origins of the Sasanians, it becomes a matter of extracting information in that level from the sources. And sources sometimes end up being as meager as the coins. So I'm going to end it here. I have talked for about 2 minutes, which I think is more than enough. We have another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to turn on the comments, and if there are any questions, please do ask, and I would love to answer. There we go. Any criticism or any comments on the contents and the presentation would also be welcomed. As I said, this is in a sense, you could say it was episode 0 of this whole thing. So it would be good to know what you think about the structure of it as well. Let me also read one of the questions that was already asked. Is there any material investigating the conspiracies of the Sasanian court at the time of Khosrow II? Yes, there is, and that is going to be the subject of much later. But yes, there is. There's good material actually. A lot of it coming from the court records of Khosrow, but that is for much later. So, anything? No questions? Everybody's very clear? I am very happy. So, if we do not have any questions asking, I shall leave it for a bit, and while letting this go on, I might bring up a couple of details that I wanted to bring, and I didn't want to talk too much to take away from the question time. As I mentioned, the issue of the cultic connection of the Sasanians, for me, is not really acceptable. It's not denying that there was some sort of an imperial ideology or religion going on there. But I do not think that we need to create the empire and the imperial founders as religious authorities themselves, because this seems to be the norm that we want it to be, and we want to create this myth of a greater centralized religion, and I think for this is too early. I am willing to admit and concede that there might be a royal family cult, but that the members of the empire actually having the role of priests of that cult, for me, there is no evidence for it, basically. So historically, I don't see the reason for it, or I don't see the evidence for it. But I would like to hear arguments against it, I suppose. Somebody is asking, thank you for the talk. When exactly does Zoroastrianism become bold for Sasanians? That's one of the reasons I don't like the idea of an imperial cult, because what is Zoroastrianism over there? We have to start defining Zoroastrianism. That's not something that I'm really too willing to get into. Maybe I bring friends on as people to be interviewed on this later to talk about Zoroastrianism. But Zoroastrianism is not a defined religion at this point. I will talk about what is there as far as a religion when we get to the famous Kerdir, which everybody seems to be obliged to address, although I don't find him as important as a lot of people want him to think. But maybe in that sense, I would say something about the imperial religion, and if there is something called Zoroastrianism. But at this point, certainly there is nothing. Somebody else, what is the origin of the new theory about Sasanians? How do we know this theory in the first place? What theory are you talking about? Could you please be more clear? Somebody meanwhile asked, I'm just confused. Does Sasanian coins include 2 heads or just one side with fire? Sasanian coins includes one bust on the front, on the obverse. On the back, there are the pictures of a fire altar with attendants. But pre-Sasanian Persis coins, including the early coins of Ardashir, includes the heads of both kings. So Ardashir, and then on the reverse is the bust of his father, Babak. And the question is, what did happen to Greek culture in Pars? Was Pars a fusion between Iranian and Greek culture, or even Semitic? I am sorry, that requires a whole lot of argumentation about what is Arab, what is Semitic, what is Greek, what is Iranian. I don't think the division is that clear. I don't think we can actually pronounce anything on that. It's not Greek culture, it's Hellenistic culture, which has certain characteristics, which is not necessarily even Greek or limited to Greece. It's not a matter of ethnic clash, it's a matter of cultural and political culture. So I don't like the division between the Iranian and Greek and Semitic culture so clearly. Nothing happens to the Greek culture in Iran. It is there. Greek culture is part of the Iranian culture, continues to be part of the Iranian culture. It continues to be part of the Iranian languages. Persian is full of Greek words. A lot of things that is established is coming from Greek and Hellenistic background. So nothing happens. It's just that the characteristics of Hellenism, as we define them often, are missing. Let me see the questions over there. Difference between iconography of the Sasanian and Arsacid coins. Okay, I will say a bit about that. Is there a Sasanian coin with Christian signs on it? Okay, if I want to talk about coinage, we could go on an entire tangent of its own. Iconographically, Sasanian coinage is not completely divorced from the Arsacid ones. It is related. The obverse and the reverse styles are related. The general shape is borrowed from the Hellenistic coinage of Alexander and his followers, his successors. The obverse front usually shows the bust of a king with a name and with some text invoking a god. The Sasanian one becomes quite characteristic. I will talk about it probably not the next session, the one after that. The reverse shows some sort of religious iconography, so either a god or some sort of an icon, or eventually, as you will see in the Sasanians, the fire altar, which becomes very prominent. So it's not really that different, but yes, we can tell them apart, but there is a continuity. Sorry, the second question was, is there a Christian iconography? Well, it's too early for Christianity at this point anyway, to have made effect on any coinage anywhere. But no, there is no, throughout the Sasanian rule, there is no clear Christian iconography on any of the Sasanian coins. Somebody asked, the eastern origin of the Sasanians from a king in Sistan and Kerman. That theory is based on, well, I would refer you to the article by Mareki and Olbrecht. It's called the Sasanian Dynastic Connections. It was published, I don't have the book in front of me, but if you leave a comment on this video later, I will actually, I can give you the full bibliography. He is the one who has written on it. The evidence for it, and I actually believe in it, so I say it in the first chapter of my book as well. Sensible to actually say it. It is a valid argument in my opinion. But if you want to argue that based on details, this is not the place. I have written about it. Marek has written about it. I think you should. This is a matter of reading and then discussing. Youssef, do we know in which language the Persis kings recorded their archives? Youssef Jan, you're asking this question, and you probably know the answer better than me. No, because what are the archives at all? What archives do we have? No, we don't have much evidence. There is not much even epigraphy from them. I have the idea and the opinion that the Persis series is written in early Middle Persian, but I don't really, I wouldn't put my neck on the line for that. I get a feeling that they are, but I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Anything else? Okay, I think I answered all of the questions here. Talk a little about the technical process of extracting data from the archaeological coins. What do you mean? You mean generally from the coins? Technicality, there is no technicality other than knowing numismatics. Numismatics is a science, is a knowledge, is a field of inquiry. So other than knowing numismatics, I don't know how to tell you. It is the process of knowing things about coinage iconography, about the technicality of their issuing. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. There is no other technicality than actually being able to study coinage. There is something technical about it, which is called dice study, which is basically figuring out all the coins that are issued from the same obverse die and all the ones that are done from the same reverse die. This is how you issue coins. You have something sort of in the shape of a cylinder with the sort of the negative of the back of the coin, of the reverse of the coin at the bottom, and you have the same one that is movable with the front or obverse of the coin. You put the blank coin, you put that one on the top, and then you hit it with a hammer. So the pressure causes for the coin to be produced. So studying that, which one of these top ones, the obverse, which one of the bottom ones, the reverse, are actually used for each different coins is called die study. But that's a very technical detail that has really nothing to do with our work here. Given the Eastern origin of the Sasanian, what's the reason behind unusual enmity of the Sasanian towards Arsacids? I don't think there is an unusual enmity of the Sasanians towards Arsacids. That's a historiographical trope that I disagree with, actually. I will go through it. I don't think there is any enmity. They're obviously replacing them. They are not very fond of them, obviously, but there is no particular enmity. They're replacing them. They are changing some of their narratives, but it's not as hostile as we might think or has been presented. Plus the fact that if they are the Eastern people, it really has nothing to do with it. They might be the continuation of the Eastern Arsacid dynasty. Again, I suggest you read that article. Any royal tomb mausoleum from Sasanian era known outside the Persepolis-Pasargadae complex? There is nothing Sasanian in the Persepolis-Pasargadae complex. They are not Sasanian, they're Achaemenids. There is no Sasanian tombs. Sasanians probably didn't bury their dead. So there are no tombs, no. And as far as I know, there is nothing funerary particularly mentioned for Sasanians. There are funerary inscriptions, but they are not for Sasanian kings. Thank you. You're welcome, Yusuf Jan. I asked because my historical knowledge about that is not updated. Oh, yes. Yeah, no. So, okay. Yeah, the simple answer is we have no archives. Persis kings have no archives as far as we know. I would love to find archives. What we have from the Persis kings is their coins. And from the Persis period, we have those graffiti on Persepolis palaces. So that's all we really know. I might end by saying that, as you can see, Persepolis kept on being used. The idea that Persepolis was absolutely abandoned after Alexander is ludicrous. It didn't happen like that. It continued on, and in the late Frataraka Persis period, it actually was there. Thank you for the very informative lecture. Thank you very much. You're welcome. I'm glad it was useful. I hope it was clear. I know this part is a bit confusing because people don't know anything about the narrative. So I was bringing something completely new about the background of the Sasanians. Do we expect any major archaeological finding that is, how can I know about the expectations? That's a counterfactual question. I don't know how to answer it. I'm just going, please talk a little about the technical material. Sorry, I'm trying to find new questions. Okay, I don't find any new questions. If you need to contact me, you can just private message me on this account or leave a comment on this video, and then we can talk. Thank you very much. The time is ending. Thank you very much for being there, and until